Okay, here we are, Kinesiology 223, Chapter 12. Still talking about psychological skills training, and this is more in regards to psychological skills training effectiveness. You have to understand the environment, but you also have to understand the interventions and be able to control those interventions. You know, when you start talking with an athlete, and we've talked about this before, where you have the two different populations in a study. You know, you're kind of studying the environment, and you actually have a test itself, and you're testing one of the variables. So you change a variable. So it's what you say or how you say it. And it'll be a work in progress. And when you go through perhaps, a couple seasons with different athletes, you get better at knowing what works and what doesn't work. But what you'll find with this is when you look at one of the studies that they present in the book, they found that psychological and psychosocial interventions both enhance sport performance, though psychosocial enhance performance to a higher level. Performance enhancement lasted for about 1 month after the intervention, whatever that intervention was, and then the effects were greater when delivered by a coach, and then the effects were greater for male versus female athletes. So this, if you kind of dissect it, what it tells you is, okay, so you have psychological and psychosocial. Psychosocial was greater, which tells you it works better in a group environment than one-on-one. Got it. So maybe you deliver your psychological skills training in a group environment more than one-on-one, though I would say you probably want to have a balance between those, group oriented versus just group oriented and one-on-one oriented. And then performance enhancement lasted for about 1 month. So now you can start to formulate a timeline. If I introduce something in today, I have about 1 month before I have basically a half-life, if you will, where it fully erodes. And I probably want to not wait for an entire month to have another intervention. Maybe, perhaps, I have an intervention today, and then I have another intervention next week, another intervention after that. And I spend a little bit of time, as I mentioned before, just having like this constant drip of information and working with my athletes for psychological skills training. You want the predominance of the psychological skills training to come from the coach, not so much from the other athletes. And what I don't like about this is they're not really talking about a practitioner versus a coach. You have like a person who's an actual sports psychologist come in versus a coach, but I think we'll talk about that a little bit later on and maybe next two presentations. And really with this greater for male versus female, I'm not sure, the differentiation on that and why the difference. They don't really elaborate, but unfortunately, they just didn't have anything to add to that. So psychosocial, when you look at it, it's inclusive of the psychological and the social aspects. So there's a little bit more robustness there. It actually carries more weight. You have the social factors in place where you have teammates communication that could be surrounding the person, supporting dialogue from the teammates, and ends up being a case where whatever your message is supported not just by one person, but by the entire team. Now, I just put this out here, the psychological and psychosocial interventions enhanced by sports performance. Psychosocial was greater, and I found a study out here on Google Scholars. You can just control click that right from the slide, and I'll take you out to the Google Scholar link for that. But, you start to ask questions why psychosocial was better than just straight psychological skills training from the coach. And then in a one-on-one environment, and then maybe, when you get to Google Scholar, you can do a little research as to why maybe men are more receptive to this style of training than females. Could be perhaps who's delivering the content, male coach, female coach, who knows. But I would look at Google Scholar for research points just to kind of learn a little bit more. Now, the higher the level of the athlete, the more likely that they have or will participate in mental training. And you see this, or hear these stories all the time about athletes who, not only are they performing in the pool every day or they're on the gymnastics mat every day, but they have to do some degree of psychological skills training to really heighten their game and to have an edge in performance, whether it's to down-regulate negative talk or up-regulate positive talk. At this point, I can't speak to either one. But what you have is the higher the level of competition, the more likely that person will participate in psychological skills training. And the best practices to this seem to draw from a variety of different techniques to create a more integrated program. And I, I like this, but as I mentioned earlier in a different presentation, it's good, but what would make it great is if we're talking about using educationally based interventions with the skill and knowledge or wisdom of the coach. And now it becomes the art of coaching, not just the science of coaching. And I think we could have seen that in this book a little bit more, but they kind of breezed over that component. But I think, you're really missing a key part here where it's like you can have all this information at your fingertips, but if you don't know how to integrate it correctly, you got a problem. So if we cut out here, I'm gonna go ahead and pause this. Hold on a second. On page, let me snap this open just a little bit more. On page 281, if I drag this down, you have alternative models focusing on performance excellence. I like this. I think it's something that has its place. And as I mentioned earlier, you have these gray boxes that are kind of like a little, some of them are pretty good, some of them are not so great, but these thus far in this chapter have been just spot on and really informational. And you look at like pure performance, how, you look at one type of model versus focus, inspiration, trust, and then you get down here to pace. I would highly recommend you take a moment and kind of review this information and become familiar with what the pace model is, what the mental fitness is, and then also pure performance. I'm almost certain you're going to see those later on. I'm not going to sit here and read these to you over a presentation. That's just, you're in college, you should be reading out of your book anyways. But long story short, I would take a moment to review this information because I think it is good information. I'm almost certain you're going to see it somewhere else. Hold on. Okay, so here we are back in the presentation. Let's go ahead and just close this out at this point, and I'm going to move on to the next presentation, but I'll say it again. When you start talking about psychological skills training, there is the knowledge side and the wisdom side, and there's a very witty video, I'm sure you can just Google it, where this gentleman's a rugby player, and they ask him what's the difference between a fruit and a vegetable, and his reply, or they ask him what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. I'm sorry, so I gave up the punchline. The difference between knowledge and wisdom, he said, knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit. He goes, but the wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad. I thought it's incredibly hilarious, but there's a lot to be said for that. And that comes from experience. All right, guys, have yourself a good one. On to the next presentation.